Continuing now with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's The Final Days. We left off at the end of the last session. We were in the middle of chapter 12. So we'll continue now with that chapter. In the executive office building, many middle-level and junior presidential aides regularly stopped by the office of Mort Allen, who was in charge of compiling the president's daily news summary. There were wire service machines in the reception area, and the staff liked to drift through and see what was new. Today, Scott's and Rhodes's statements dominated both the news and the conversation in Allen's office. The GOP leadership's retreat was unprecedented and profoundly depressing, and other angry remarks from traditional Nixon supporters were coming over the ticker. Across West Executive Avenue, Haig flew into a rage when he was informed of Scott's statement. The disloyalty, the spinelessness of the man. Scott had not even warned the White House. Haig called him. "You've betrayed me," he shouted over the phone, as if he were chewing out a corporal. Defensively, Scott said that his comments had not specified anybody in particular. Bullshit. Scott knew damn good and well whom the comments were directed at and what harm they would cause the president. The White House was trying to clear up the matter once and for all, and now this. The conversation ended abruptly. Scott was not Haig's major source of concern, however. The general had just received word from the president that there would be no more tapes for anybody. Period. He was not going to submit to Jaworski's blackmail. He was not going to feed the Judiciary Committee's insatiable demands. He had gone too far already. Haig understood the implications of the president's words all too clearly. He informed St. Clair. St. Clair phoned Jaworski. "The president does not wish to make any agreement," he announced. "His decision is final." Jaworski couldn't think of much to say. He kept thinking how St. Clair was overstressing the fact that it was the president's decision, his decision alone. Jaworski politely acknowledged the call. The fact that the president would not negotiate further was a signal. There could be only one meaning. The tapes were incriminating. The president would rather risk disclosure of the grand jury's secret action than surrender the tapes. At 4 o'clock, St. Clair moved to inform the world in general and the House Committee in particular of the president's decision, dressing it in a cloak of presidential principle. The setting was Cocktails with Clausen, another of the presidential communications director's public relations innovations. Invited reporters were served glasses of soft drinks wrapped in napkins printed especially for these occasions, during which members of the administration made themselves available for interviews in an informal atmosphere. Sitting in a wing chair, his legs crossed and his hands extended, St. Clair said there would be no more tapes for anyone. The president had told the full story of Watergate in the transcripts he had already released. The only basis for further requests would be a desire by some to erode the presidency, and the president is not going to stand for it, St. Clair said defiantly. If others persisted, quote, "then we are going to have a confrontation because the president is firm in his resolve that he has done more than is necessary." On Capitol Hill, Barbara Conable was indignant. What had become of the reasonable, conciliatory approach St. Clair had outlined at breakfast? There had been no suggestion of flat rejection. Conable now concluded that some way would have to be found to disassociate the Republican Party from Richard Nixon. On the House floor and in the cloakrooms late that Tuesday afternoon, Conable found a consensus that Nixon was a liability to the party. Some members were getting hysterical. Still, Conable decided to wait for a few days. That afternoon, the president finished his listening. Cueing a tape from April 19, 1973, Steve Bull found a 19-minute gap in a conversation between the president and Ehrlichman. Aghast, he hurried to inform Bizart. "It doesn't surprise me," Bizart responded casually. Philip Buchan of Grand Rapids, Michigan, dined that evening at the Georgetown home of Clay T. Whitehead, director of the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy. Buchan spent 3 days a week in Washington as executive director of the Federal Privacy Commission, headed by his former law partner, the Vice President of the United States. Whitehead was baffled by Gerald Ford. "Why isn't Ford doing something to organize himself?" he asked. "He knows that the Nixon administration is crippled. Is the Vice President prepared to take over?" "Far from it," Buchan said. He had known Ford for years and was probably his closest friend. "Jerry can't do anything because it would look like he was abandoning Nixon," he told Whitehead. Ford was not the type of person to assert himself in such a delicate situation. And the Vice President's staff was inept, Buchan said. They had done nothing to prepare for a Ford presidency. Buchan, however, had been giving the matter a great deal of thought. "I'm convinced that there is a real possibility that Nixon will resign or be impeached," he continued. And because neither Ford nor his staff could be relied on, someone had to begin planning immediately for a transition. He suggested they establish a small team. Whitehead, a Ph.D. who got his political education in the Nixon White House, had worked on the 1968 presidential transition. He was still an official of the Nixon administration, but his disaffection was almost complete. He had been an architect of the aggressive White House policy toward the television networks, a true believer, but for almost a year he had operated as if there were no president. Twice Haig had almost pleaded with him not to bring important matters before Nixon, citing the president's inability to act. "The president isn't in any shape to deal with this," Haig had told him once. Whitehead looked forward to a Ford presidency. Perhaps the lost promise of the Nixon administration could be reclaimed there. He agreed to help prepare for a transition of power. "Jerry can't know what's going on," Buchan stressed. "Absolute secrecy is necessary." They discussed who might join them. Buchan called it the Whitehead Project. Whitehead called it the Buchan Project. The next morning, May 8th, Scott received a call from George Bush, chairman of the Republican National Committee. Bush was having trouble keeping the party professionals in line. A move for Nixon's resignation was developing. "Things were getting worse on the Hill, too," Scott said. "What in the world do we do now?" asked Bush. Scott said that he didn't know either. Rhodes phoned next. "At least 10 members have told me today that they are off the reservation." The same thing was happening on the Senate side, Scott said. Rhodes had talked with Goldwater about playing the whole card. Goldwater was ready to go along with whatever the minority leaders decided. The erosion of support for the president had been worse in the past few days than in the entire year before, said Rhodes. The White House response to the disaffection came that afternoon from the administration's resident Jesuit priest, Dr. John McLaughlin, a special assistant to the president. Meeting with reporters, Father McLaughlin advanced a theological analysis of the transcripts that attempted to prove that they were neither amoral nor immoral. Senator Scott's characterization, said the priest, was erroneous, unjust, and contains elements of hypocrisy. The president acquitted himself throughout these discussions with honor. Nixon spent most of the day by himself. At 6:30 p.m., he boarded the presidential yacht Sequoia for a trip down the Potomac. He sent his strip steak back to the galley because there was fat on it. A steward cut the fat off and returned the steak to the president, who sat alone at the dining table, gazing out at the shoreline. At a routine economic meeting with the Republican leadership at 8:30 the next morning, Nixon exchanged pleasantries with Senator Scott, who sat next to him. The minority leader's remarks about the transcripts were not mentioned. The president seemed even more bored than usual. He did not engage in any of his long monologues. After the meeting, George Bush told Barbara Conable that he was considering resigning as Republican National Chairman. Conable did not try to dissuade him. Haig approached Conable a moment later. "They're getting a little testy up on Capitol Hill, aren't they?" Haig said, a sarcastic grin on his face. "Yes," Conable answered soberly. House Minority Leader Rhodes did not attend the leadership meeting at the White House. He was breakfasting with a group of reporters at the Sheraton Carlton Hotel, 3 blocks from the White House, across Lafayette Park. He was grim and blunt. It might be a good idea for the president to consider resignation as an alternative to impeachment. "If Nixon comes to conclude that he can no longer be effective as president, he will do something about it," Rhodes suggested. "If he should resign, I would accept it. Resignation, quote, would probably be beneficial to the party." As Rhodes and his press assistant, J. Bryan Smith, left the hotel by car, Smith said, "Your statement is going to make headlines." "I did it on purpose," Rhodes said, settling into the seat. "That's how I feel." A few moments later, he turned to Smith. "You can't imagine how miserable I feel when I can't support the president." House Republican Conference Chairman John B. Anderson of Illinois, the third-ranking House Republican, also held a press conference that morning. Anderson, gray-haired and urbane, a graduate of Harvard Law and a liberal, was hated by the Nixon administration. Convinced that the transcripts revealed a total moral collapse in the White House, he was equally disturbed at the reaction to them by most of his colleagues on the Hill, by the president's aides, and even by the press. There was no acceptable alternative to immediate resignation, Anderson asserted. The March 21st tape alone established, quote, "a prima facie case for obstruction of justice," end quote. If the president did not resign, he faced certain impeachment. The first editions of that afternoon's newspapers played Rhodes's and Anderson's comments together. Though they had said somewhat different things, the distinction was lost, and their statements seemed to suggest a major move by influential Republicans to secure the president's resignation. Editorials in that day's Chicago Tribune, perhaps the staunchest Republican newspaper in the country, in the conservative Omaha World Herald, and in the Hearst newspapers, all called on the president to resign. William Randolph Hearst, Jr., editor-in-chief of the Hearst chain, and for years one of Nixon's strongest supporters, signed the editorial himself. At noon, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield hurried to meet Senator Scott. They agreed that anything could happen now, and they decided that they should meet with Ford as soon as he returned from a speaking tour in Illinois. Even Ford seemed to step back from Nixon that afternoon. Speaking at Eastern Illinois University, he told the class of 1974, "While it may be easy to delete characterization from the printed page, we cannot delete characterization from people's minds with a wave of the hand. That is why I am speaking frankly on the subject, perhaps more so than some of my colleagues might wish." At 1:08 p.m., Chairman Peter Rodino brought down the gavel to open the House Judiciary Committee's formal hearings on impeachment. The ceremony, following 7 months of staff investigation, was carried live on national television for 20 minutes. Then, after a brief debate, the committee voted 31-6 to close its doors for business, consideration of the evidence. 2 thick binders were placed on each member's desk. Committee counsel John Doerr began reading from the first volume in a monotone that seemed to drive part of the committee to distraction and put the rest to sleep. St. Clair was permitted to remain to hear the evidence against his client. As he entered, he had told reporters, "The president will not be impeached. The House of Representatives will not impeach." Then, as he took his seat at the counsel's table in front of the 2-tiered platform where the 38 members of the committee sat, St. Clair heard what sounded like 1,000 cameras clicking. He thought once again of the Army McCarthy hearings. He was relieved that the hearings were beginning. At least he'd know where he'd be each day for the coming weeks, maybe months. The hearings might be a pro forma exercise, but being there was preferable to being at the beck and call of Haig and the president. St. Clair would get a call some mornings to come to the West Wing and would wind up spending 8 or 9 hours there, mostly waiting around. He would return to his desk in the EOB in the evening, exhausted from the frustration. He was tired of it all. On the few occasions when he had been permitted to see the president, Nixon had rambled on about nothing, often making little sense. After the Judiciary Committee adjourned that afternoon, reporters asked St. Clair for his reaction. On balance, he said, "I'd rather be back in Boston practicing law." Anderson had a 4 o'clock appointment with Scott. They sat on one of the gold brocade couches in the minority leader's office. Anderson argued passionately that a delegation should be sent to the president to urge him to resign. "I do not favor that now," Scott replied. "Each person should make his own judgment. Certainly no collective action is timely now. The time will come, but it is not now." The troops still weren't there in sufficient numbers. Anderson thought that Scott lacked courage. A light rain fell through most of the day. The president met a delegation of Vietnam War veterans, several favored congressmen, 5 departing staff members, and Bruce Hershenshone, one of the anti-media writers on his staff, and Hershenshone's parents. 2 people from Louisiana presented petitions of support to the president. Ziegler told reporters about the president's, quote, mood of determination. Deputy Press Secretary Gerald Warren elaborated, "Let me restate what I thought I made clear yesterday. The president has every intention to complete the work of his administration. He is determined to remain in office despite the discussions by some and attacks by others." Bebe Rebozo, who was testifying before the staff of the Senate Watergate Committee, described the president as in high spirits. Nixon would never resign, Rebozo told reporters, because, quote, he is confident he has done nothing wrong. White House Communications Director Clausen stated, "The president will not quit, even if hell freezes over, no matter what." All afternoon, Rhodes's office was swamped with phone calls objecting to the minority leader's remarks on resignation. Some of the callers threatened his life. An FBI agent was sent to his office to stand guard. That evening, at a party on Capitol Hill, Rhodes went through a receiving line in which the First Lady was standing. Approaching her, Rhodes summoned the brightest smile he could manage. "How are you, Mrs. Nixon?" he asked. A photographer asked them to pose for a picture. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Nixon said. "Let's smile as if we liked each other." "Mrs. Nixon," Rhodes said, "it isn't the way you heard it." "Yeah," she shot back, "that's what they all say." Haig was finally convinced that the White House lacked a coherent strategy. Father McLaughlin, whom Haig detested, speaking about morality, and Ken Clausen talking about hell freezing over, weren't going to do the job. Timmons, Clausen, Buchanan, Gergen, and some of the lawyers have been urging for weeks that a strategy committee be established to coordinate the president's legal and public relations defense. Haig had another Gergen memo on his desk, organizing for impeachment. This time, Haig did not toss the advice into his wastepaper basket. Instead, he read, "It is time we faced up to the fact that this operational work is a full-time task. It can no longer be done with the left hand." Gergen was right, Haig decided. He summoned Dean Birch, the White House liaison to the Republican Party, to head the committee. They agreed that Buchanan, Timmons, Clausen, Gergen, Garment, and Bazart should serve on it. Birch called the members to his office that day, Friday, May 10th. Their first task was to contend with the rumors that were sweeping the city, including one that the president's resignation was imminent. Nixon had met privately with Vice President Ford for 55 minutes that morning, contributing to the waves of speculation. Not all the rumors predicted resignation. One held that Nixon was going to issue a statement, another that he would call a news conference, a third that he would address the nation on television. A fourth said Nixon was turning over all the tapes under subpoena. Another had the cabinet being assembled in an emergency session to hear the president. Yet another had Secretary of State Kissinger flying back from the Middle East to accept the president's resignation letter. The Birch group was bewildered. There seemed to be no solution other than to deny the rumors, and Jerry Warren had been doing that all day. The pressure became so intense that Ziegler finally called the New York Times with a statement. "The city of Washington is full of rumors. All that have been presented to me today are false, and the one that heads the list is the one that says President Nixon intends to resign. His attitude is one of determination that he will not be driven out of office by rumor, speculation, excessive charges, or hypocrisy. He is up for the battle, he intends to fight it, and he feels he has a personal and constitutional duty to do so." That evening, the president decided to take a ride on the Sequoia again. He left with his wife, David, and Julie shortly before 6. David had just finished an exam, and they were out to celebrate. It was a warm, pleasant evening. The breeze was refreshing. The four went topside and, sitting in the wicker chairs, sipped drinks. There had been another Beebe story in the papers that day. It said that Rebozo was under investigation for an unreported $50,000 political contribution he had collected in cash. Such stories almost always altered the president's mood and made him even more withdrawn than usual. Nothing seemed to sting the president as much as watching his friends being consumed by the scandal. As the yacht cruised downriver, a military aide approached the president. Photographers were waiting on the pier for the Sequoia to return, he said. More were lined up on the Potomac bridges in the hope of getting a picture as the boat passed underneath. Nixon left his chair abruptly and started pacing. They were trying to get a picture of his face, goddammit. They were attempting to discover how he was handling the pressure. He picked up the ship-to-shore telephone. "Crown, get me Ziegler." Crown was the code name for the White House switchboard. The president was using an unsecure line. Anyone else listening could have heard only half of what was being said, however, because the send and receive ends of the conversation were on two different frequencies. Ziegler came on the line. "God damn it," Nixon shouted into the phone. "Why was the press always hounding him? Why couldn't he get a few private moments? How had it leaked out that he was aboard the Sequoia? God damn it, he hadn't wanted it discovered. Why couldn't Ziegler control the press? God damn it, oh God damn it." All week, David Eisenhower had noticed a strange, wavering quality in the president's voice. David was looking for signs of collapse in his father-in-law. He concluded there was no way to calm Mr. Nixon with words. Quickly, he climbed up to the bridge to talk to Lieutenant Commander Andrew Combe. Something had to be done. There was no way of knowing who would be waiting at the Navy Yard to witness the president's anger. They must outfox the press and dock elsewhere. There were only two alternatives, the skipper told David: to cruise to Mount Vernon and order a helicopter to take them back to the White House, or to dock at the old Anacostia Pier. But two Navy tugs were berthed at Anacostia, and it might be difficult to get them cleared out of the way. David went back to check on the president. He was talking quietly to the others now, and he seemed calmer. In just a few minutes, the fit of anger seemed to have subsided. David went topside again. He told Combe that it would be all right to dock at the usual location. Half an hour later, the boat slid into its berth at the Navy Yard, and the president rushed into the waiting limousine before photographers could get a glimpse of him. The days of May 1974 were lonely ones for Mrs. Nixon. I think I'm going to stop right here, and so we'll continue next time in our next session with the remainder of Chapter 12 of The Final Days by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. Thanks for watching.